Mason Rhodes had everything: wealth, power, and a sprawling farm empire. But when a reckless bet challenges him to make a woman fall in love with him without using his money, he targets hard-working Grace Mitchell. What starts as a game turns into something real. But will she forgive the deception? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Mason Rhodes stood on the wraparound porch of his sprawling farmhouse, surveying his kingdom. 5,000 acres of prime farmland stretched before him, green and lush under the morning sun. Tractors worth more than most people's homes dotted the landscape. Workers scurried about like ants, following his orders to the letter. At 35, Mason had everything a man could want. His family farm had expanded into one of the most profitable agricultural enterprises in the county. His home was featured in fancy magazines. His bank account had more zeros than most people would see in a lifetime, everything except someone to share it with. Not that he cared much about that. Mason had learned long ago that people were usually after his money, not his heart. And that was fine by him. Hearts were messy. Money was clean, simple. The sound of expensive tires on gravel announced visitors. Mason turned to see a shiny black SUV pull up his driveway. Right on time. His friends always said they admired his punctuality, but the truth was, Mason couldn't stand wasting time. Time was money, after all. "Mason, my man," Richard Coleman called out as he stepped from the vehicle. Behind him emerged Blake Thompson and Victor Davis. The three men made up Mason's inner circle, fellow wealthy landowners, who'd inherited family fortunes and turned them into empires. "Boys," Mason nodded, offering firm handshakes as they climbed the porch steps. "Drinks are ready in the study." The four men settled into leather chairs, crystal tumblers of amber whiskey in hand. These monthly gatherings had become tradition, a former chance to boast about profits, complain about workers, and one-up each other with tales of conquest both in business and pleasure. "So," Blake said after his first sip, "how's the eternal bachelor doing, still breaking hearts all over the county?" Mason shrugged. "No time for that nonsense. Spring planting won't manage itself." Richard laughed. "Always the businessman, I swear. Mason, sometimes I think you've got spreadsheets where your heart should be." "Don't need a heart to run a successful operation," Mason replied coolly. Victor leaned forward, swirling his drink. "You know what your problem is, Mason? You've never had to work for anything. Money, land, women, it all just falls into your lap." Mason's eyes narrowed. "I work harder than anyone in this room." "At the business, sure," Victor conceded. "But not at anything that matters. When's the last time you had to actually try to get something you wanted?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Mason didn't like where this was heading. "What's your point?" he asked. Richard and Blake exchanged glances, a mischievous spark in their eyes. "We've been talking," Richard said, "and we think you need a challenge, something to prove you're not just your bank account." Mason took a long sip of his whiskey. "I'm listening." Blake grinned. "A bet, something to make things interesting." "What kind of bet?" Mason asked, his competitive nature already piqued despite his better judgment. Victor set down his glass with a decisive clink. "We bet that you can't make a woman fall in love with you without using your money or status." Mason scoffed. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Richard challenged. "Or are you afraid you couldn't do it?" "I could charm any woman I wanted," Mason said, his pride flaring. "But why would I waste my time?" "To prove us wrong," Blake said simply. "And to make things interesting, we'll set the stakes at, let's say, $100,000. Mason barely blinked at the number. It was pocket change to men like them. "And to make sure you don't cheat," Victor added, "she has to be someone who doesn't know who you are. Someone who wouldn't normally run in our circles. Like one of your farmhands," Richard suggested with a cruel smile. "And to really prove it's not about the money," Blake added, "you have to marry her." Mason nearly choked on his drink. "Marry her? Have you lost your minds?" "Scared?" Victor taunted. Mason's jaw tightened. He'd never backed down from a challenge in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. "And how exactly would I prove she loves me?" he asked. "You'll know," Richard said. "And so will we. When a woman loves a man, it's written all over her. Then, once you're sure she's fallen for you, you reveal the truth about the bet." "That's cruel," Mason said, surprising even himself with the observation. "Since when do you care about being cruel?" Blake asked. "Besides, You can divorce her after. Pay her off whatever you want. Mason stared into his glass, weighing his options. It was a ridiculous proposition, manipulative, cold, but $100,000, and the satisfaction of proving his friends wrong was tempting. Fine, he said at last. You're on. The men clinked glasses, sealing the bet that would change everything. 3 days later, Mason found himself doing something he'd never done before, touring the workers' area of his farm. Usually, he left the management of laborers to his foreman, preferring to focus on the business side of things. But now, dressed in jeans and a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual tailored attire, he walked among the fields where seasonal workers picked strawberries. The spring harvest was in full swing, and dozens of people bent over the rows, filling baskets with the ripe red fruit. "Looking for someone in particular, Mr. Rhodes?" asked Jim, his foreman, clearly confused by Mason's presence. "Just checking on operations," Mason replied vaguely. "Any standout workers you'd recommend?" Jim scratched his head. "Well, there's a new girl who started last week, Grace something. Hardest worker I've seen in years. Always first to arrive, last to leave." Mason tried to sound casual. "Point her." "Out to me." Jim led him down the rows until they came to a slender woman with honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Unlike some of the others who chatted as they worked, she focused intently on her task, her movements efficient and quick. Even from a distance, Mason could see she'd filled more baskets than those around her. "That's her," Jim said. "Grace Mitchell. Said she needed the money for her mother's medical bills. Works like her life depends on it." Mason nodded. "I'd like to speak with her." "Alone?" Jim raised an eyebrow but knew better than to question his boss. "Yes, sir. I'll send her to the East Storage Shed in 5 minutes." As Jim walked away, Mason felt an unfamiliar twinge of, was it guilt? He brushed it aside. This was just a bet, a game, no different from the business deals he made every day. 5 minutes later, Mason stood in the cool shade of the storage shed, waiting. The door creaked open, and the woman from the field stepped in, squinting as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Her voice was soft but steady, with a quiet dignity that surprised him. Up close, Grace. Mitchell was more striking than he'd expected. Not beautiful in the polished way of the women he usually dated, but something about her clear hazel eyes and sun-kissed skin caught his attention. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from working too hard for too long. But she stood straight, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes," Mason said, remembering his role. For this to work, she couldn't know he was the owner. "I'm Mason. I work in quality control." Grace nodded, clearly confused about why quality control would need to speak with her. "Have I done something wrong? My picking rate is above average, I checked." "No, nothing wrong," Mason assured her. "In fact, Jim tells me you're one of our best workers." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "I try to be." "How long have you been working?" "Agricultural jobs. All my life, more or less," she said. "My daddy had a small farm until the bank took it when I was 15. Since then, I've worked wherever I could." Mason nodded, filing away this information. "And you're supporting your mother?" Grace's expression tightened. "Jim talks too much. But yes, my mom has heart problems. The medical bills," she trailed off, then seemed to gather herself. "Is there something specific you needed from me, sir? I should get back to work. We're paid by the basket." Her practicality struck Mason. Most people would have tried to curry favor with someone they perceived as management, but Grace seemed concerned only with returning to her job. "Actually," Mason said, "improvising. We're looking at creating a special team for a new organic section. Higher pay, more regular hours. Jim recommended you." Hope flickered across Grace's face before she controlled it. "What would it involve?" "Different varieties of produce, more careful handling, some training required." Mason was making it up as he went along, but realized he could actually implement such a program if needed to maintain his cover. "Would you be interested?" "What's the pay difference?" Grace asked bluntly. Mason named a figure 30% higher than standard wages. Significant enough to be attractive, but not so high it would seem suspicious. Grace's eyes widened slightly. "That would make a big difference for us. When would it start? Next week. But I'd like you to come in Saturday for some preliminary training. Just you to see if it's a good fit before we bring in others. She hesitated only briefly. I'll be there. Good. Mason handed her a business card with just his first name and a phone number. Call me if anything changes, otherwise I'll see you Saturday. 9 a.m. at the main house. The main house? Alarm flashed across her face. I thought field workers weren't allowed there. Special circumstances, Mason said smoothly. Don't worry, you won't get in trouble. Grace studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she nodded. Saturday at 9, I'll be there. As she turned to leave, Mason called after her. And Grace, this conversation stays between us for now. We don't want everyone applying before we're ready. Of course, she agreed, then slipped back into the bright sunlight, leaving Mason alone with his thoughts. This would be easier than he'd expected. The promise of better pay was all it would take to get her attention. From there, a few kindnesses, some personal attention, and she'd be falling for him in no time. Women like Grace, struggling, desperate, were always susceptible to a knight in shining armor. Mason ignored the voice in his head, telling him this was wrong. $100,000 and the satisfaction of winning were worth a little deception. Saturday would be the first real step in his plan. By this time next year, he'd have won the bet and be free again, $100,000 richer. What he didn't know was that fate had very different plans. Grace Mitchell's hands trembled as she turned the key in the lock of her tiny rental house. The conversation with the man named Mason had left her both hopeful and uneasy. Better pay would be a godsend, but something about him made her nervous. Not in a frightening way, but in a way that made her too aware of herself. Her shabby clothes, her calloused hands, her hair that hadn't seen a proper cut in months. "Mom, I'm home," she called as she entered. Margaret Mitchell sat in her worn recliner, an oxygen tube in her nose and a pile of mending in her lap. At 58, she looked 20 years older, her body worn down by hard work and heart disease. "How was work, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, setting aside her sewing. Grace set her lunch cooler on the kitchen counter. "Good, really good, actually. I might be getting a promotion of sorts." She explained about the special organic team, watching her mother's face brighten with each detail. "That's wonderful news. And this Mason person sought you out specifically?" "Well, on Jim's recommendation," Grace clarified. "But yes," Margaret studied her daughter. "Is he handsome, this Mason?" "Mom," Grace felt her cheeks warm, "that has nothing to do with anything." "So he is handsome," Margaret said with a knowing smile. Grace busied herself with making dinner. "He's not what I expected. Different from the usual farm managers. More refined, I guess." "Well, I think it's about time something good happened for you," Margaret said firmly. "You work too hard for too little." Grace stirred the simple soup she was preparing. "We make do." "Making do isn't living, Grace. You're 28 years old. You should be building your own life, not tied down taking care of me." This was an old argument, one Grace refused to engage in. "You're my mother. There's nowhere I'd rather be." Later that night, after her mother had gone to bed, Grace sat at their small kitchen table, calculating figures in a worn notebook. The increased wage would make a significant difference in their budget. Maybe they could even start paying down some of the medical debt instead of just keeping up with the minimum payments. She thought about Mason, with his intense blue eyes and the way he'd looked at her, like he was really seeing her, not just another worker in the fields. It had been unsettling, but not unpleasant. Grace closed her notebook with a sigh. She couldn't afford to get distracted by a handsome face. Saturday would be about securing better pay, nothing more. She had too many responsibilities to daydream about a man who was still her superior, no matter how he'd made her pulse quicken. Little did she know that Saturday would mark the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. One that would bring both heartbreak and a love deeper than she'd ever imagined possible. As Grace prepared for bed, Mason sat in his luxurious study, already planning his strategy. The bet was in motion. All he had to do was make one simple farmhand fall in love with him, and victory would be his. It never occurred to him that he might be the one at risk of falling. Saturday morning arrived with a brilliant sunrise that painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Grace had been up since dawn, too nervous to sleep. She'd tried on every decent outfit she owned before settling on her nicest pair of jeans, the ones without patches or worn spots, and a simple blue blouse she'd found on clearance last year as she drove her ancient pickup truck up the long driveway to the main house. Grace couldn't help feeling intimidated. Everyone knew about the Rhodes estate, though most workers never set foot near it. The massive white farmhouse looked like something out of a magazine, with its perfect landscaping and wrap-around porch lined with rocking chairs. "This is just a job," Grace reminded herself as she parked beside several expensive-looking vehicles. Nothing more. She checked her reflection in the rear-view mirror, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and took a deep breath. The higher pay would make a huge difference for her mother's medical bills. That's all that mattered. Grace knocked on the front door, half expecting a butler to answer. Instead, Mason himself opened it, dressed casually in jeans and a light blue button-down shirt that matched his eyes. "Grace?" he said with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased. "Right on time, come in." She stepped into a foyer with gleaming hardwood floors and a crystal chandelier overhead. The house smelled of coffee and something sweet baking. "This place is beautiful," Grace said, unable to hide her awe. "Thank you." "It's been in the family for generations," Mason replied, then quickly added, "I mean, that's what Mr. Rhodes says. I just work here." Grace nodded, accepting his explanation without question. "So what exactly will I be doing in this special organic program?" "Let's discuss it over coffee," Mason suggested, leading her through the house to a sun-filled kitchen. "I hope you don't mind, but the training space isn't quite ready yet." A spread of pastries sat on the marble island, alongside 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble," Grace said, uncomfortable with such treatment. "It's no trouble. Please help yourself." Grace accepted a mug but hesitated before taking a pastry. "Shouldn't we be starting the training?" Mason's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, but I thought we could get to know each other a bit first. Building a good team starts with understanding the people on it." Grace relaxed slightly and took a small cinnamon roll. "That makes sense." "So," Mason began, "Jim mentioned you're caring. For your mother?" Grace nodded, taking a sip of her coffee, the richest, smoothest coffee she'd ever tasted. "My mom has congestive heart failure. She can't work anymore and her insurance only covers so much." "That must be difficult." "We manage," Grace said simply, uncomfortable discussing her personal struggles. "And your father?" "He passed away when I was 18. Farm accident." She didn't elaborate on how they'd lost everything afterward. The small farm, their savings, their security. Mason studied her with an intensity that made Grace shift in her seat. "You've dealt with a lot. Everyone has their burdens," Grace replied. "I'm luckier than most. I have a job, a roof over our heads, and my mom is still with me." Her perspective seemed to surprise Mason. He looked at her with newfound interest. "What about you?" Grace asked, turning the conversation away from herself. "Have you always worked for the Rhodes farm?" A strange expression crossed Mason's face. "I joined a few years ago, in management." "You must be good at what you do," Grace observed. "This isn't typically how farmhands get treated." Mason cleared his throat. "Well, this program is important to the company. High-quality organic produce commands premium prices." They spent the next hour discussing various aspects of organic farming, with Mason explaining requirements for certification and specific handling procedures. Grace listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that clearly impressed him. "You know a lot about farming for someone who's just a field worker," Mason commented. Grace felt a flash of irritation. "I grew up on a farm. My father taught me everything he knew before we lost our land." "I didn't mean—" "It's fine," Grace cut him off. "I understand. Most people see calloused hands and assume there's nothing in the head above them." Mason looked genuinely chagrined. "That's not what I meant at all. I'm actually very impressed by your knowledge." The sincerity in his voice made Grace soften. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have snapped at you." "No, you had every right," Mason said. "I was being condescending." Their eyes met, and something passed. Between them, a moment of genuine connection that surprised them both. Mason broke the silence first. "How about I show you around the grounds? The organic plots will be over by the east field." The tour of the property stretched into the afternoon. Mason showed Grace the proposed organic fields, the state-of-the-art irrigation system, and the new greenhouse complex. Their conversation flowed more naturally as the day progressed, finding common ground in their love of the land, despite their different positions in life. "You really care about farming," Grace observed as they walked back toward the house. "It's not just a job for you." Mason's expression grew serious. "The land gets in your blood. There's something about watching things grow, about being part of that cycle of life, that changes you." The passion in his voice resonated with Grace's own feelings. For a moment she forgot he was management and she was just a field worker. They were simply two people who understood the magic of coaxing life from soil. As they reached her truck, Mason surprised her by asking, "Would you have dinner with me tomorrow night?" Grace froze. "Dinner?" To discuss the program further, he added quickly, "There's a nice place in town, nothing fancy, just good food." Warning bells rang in Grace's mind. This was crossing a line between professional and personal that could complicate things. "I don't think that would be appropriate," she said carefully, "and I need to be home for my mother in the evenings." Something like disappointment flashed across Mason's face, but he nodded. "Of course, I understand. But I'm very interested in the organic program," Grace assured him. "When does it officially start?" "Monday," Mason said. "Report to the East Field office instead of your usual station." "And, Grace?" He hesitated before continuing, "Thank you for coming today. It was enlightening." As Grace drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in her life. She told herself it was just excitement about the new opportunity, not the way Mason's blue eyes had looked into hers as if truly seeing her. Mason paced his study late into the night, unable to sleep. The day with Grace had not gone according to plan. Instead of impressing her with his charm and laying the groundwork for his seduction, he'd found himself genuinely enjoying her company. Her straightforward manner, her resilience, and her passion for farming had caught him off guard. "It's all part of the game," he told himself firmly. "Just means I need to adjust my strategy." He'd planned to dazzle her with wealth gradually, but Grace seemed immune to material displays. When he'd shown her the new greenhouse, a $1 million structure with computer-controlled climate systems, she'd been more interested in the plants than the technology. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Richard's name flashed on the screen. "How's our little bet progressing?" Richard asked without preamble when Mason answered. "Fine," Mason replied curtly. "Details, man. Have you found your future Mrs. Rhodes yet?" Mason hesitated. "Possibly a farmhand named Grace Mitchell. And is she falling for your charms?" "These things take time," Mason said. "She's not like the women we usually deal with." Richard laughed. "Don't tell me you're actually having to work for this one's attention. That's the whole point, buddy. $100,000 says you can't get a woman to love you without your money doing the talking." "I know what the bet is," Mason snapped. "I'll win it, don't worry." After hanging up, Mason felt a surge of determination. He would succeed, he always did. The fact that Grace hadn't immediately fallen for him only made the challenge more interesting. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, it wasn't thoughts of winning the bet that filled his mind, but the image of Grace's smile when she talked about her father's farm. The following week brought changes for both Mason and Grace. True to his word, Mason had established a real organic initiative, placing Grace in charge of a small team. He visited the fields daily, ostensibly to check on progress, but really to spend time with Grace. For her part, Grace threw herself into the new role with characteristic dedication. The extra pay made an immediate difference in her family's finances, allowing her to finally schedule the specialist appointment her mother had needed for months. "You're in a good mood lately," Margaret observed one evening as Grace prepared dinner. "Is it the new job or perhaps that handsome supervisor you mentioned?" Grace felt her cheeks warm. "The job is good. Mason is just my boss." Margaret hummed knowingly. "A boss who stops by every day and brings you lunch?" He brings lunch for the whole team, Grace protested. Though it wasn't entirely true, Mason did seem to pay special attention to her, always finding reasons to pull her aside for private conversations. Well, whatever it is, I haven't seen you. This happy in years, Margaret said. And I got a call from the hospital today. They said the balance on our largest bill has been paid. Grace's hand stilled. What? That's not possible. It was over $3,000. The woman said an anonymous donor covered it, Margaret explained. A clerical error, perhaps. Grace frowned. It couldn't be a coincidence that this happened, right after she started the new position. But who would pay their medical bills and why? Her thoughts immediately went to Mason, but that made no sense. He was just a farm manager, not the owner. And they barely knew each other. Still, the mystery nagged at her as she returned to work the next day. Mason was already in the field when she arrived, helping one of the workers adjust an irrigation line. The sight of him in his work clothes, hands dirty and face flushed from exertion, stirred something in Grace that she tried to ignore. "Good morning," he called when he spotted her. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Indeed, the early summer morning was perfect. Clear blue skies, a gentle breeze, and the sweet scent of ripening fruit filling the air. "It is," Grace agreed, approaching him. "Can I talk to you for a minute? Privately?" Mason's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, leading her a short distance away from the others. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Grace studied his face, looking for any sign that he knew something. "My mother received an interesting call yesterday. Apparently, someone anonymously paid off one of her largest medical bills. If she'd expected shock or guilt to cross Mason's face, she was disappointed. He merely looked pleased. "That's wonderful news," he said. "Perhaps the hospital has some kind of charity program." "Perhaps," Grace said slowly. "It just seems like a strange coincidence." Mason shrugged. "Sometimes good things happen to good people. You deserve a break, Grace." Before she could press further, one of the workers called for Mason's assistance. He excused himself, leaving Grace to wonder if she was imagining connections that weren't there. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. Mason found reasons to be wherever Grace was working. Casual conversations turned into shared lunches, which evolved into walks around the property after the day's work was done. Despite her initial reservations, Grace found herself looking forward to these moments. Mason was unlike anyone she'd ever met, educated and refined, yet genuinely interested in her thoughts and experiences. He never made her feel less for being a farmhand, and his passion for the land matched her own. One evening, as they watched the sunset from a hill overlooking the eastern fields, Mason asked about her dreams. "If money wasn't an issue," he said, "what would you do?" Grace considered the question seriously. "I'd buy back my father's farm. It wasn't large, only 40 acres, but it was beautiful. Rich soil, a spring-fed pond, old-growth trees along the back property line." "You could do more than 40 acres now with your experience," Mason pointed out. "It's not about the size," Grace explained. "It's about the connection. 3 generations of my family poured their lives into that land. When we lost it..." She trailed off, the pain still fresh even after all these years. Mason was quiet for a moment. "What if you could get it back?" "The bank sold it years ago," Grace said. "The new owners built some fancy weekend retreat. They don't even farm it." "But if you could," Mason pressed, "would that make you happy?" Grace looked at him curiously. "Why are you asking me this?" "I just want to know what matters to you," he said softly. Their eyes met, and Grace felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the setting sun or the gentle breeze. Mason was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Grace," he said, his voice low, "I'd like to take you to dinner tomorrow night, not to discuss work, just dinner." Warning bells rang in Grace's mind again, louder this time. Getting involved with someone from management was risky. If things went wrong, she could lose her job, a job her mother depended on. But something in Mason's eyes made her hesitate. There was a vulnerability there she hadn't seen before, as if her answer truly mattered to him. "My mother," she began. "I understand if you need to be home," Mason said quickly. "We could have an early dinner or lunch on Sunday, perhaps." His eagerness made Grace smile despite herself. "Sunday lunch might work. My neighbor stays with Mom after church until about 3. The smile that broke across Mason's face was like the sun emerging from clouds. Sunday it is. As they walked back to the main property, their hands brushed, once, twice, then a third time when Mason gently caught her fingers with his own. The contact sent a jolt of awareness through Grace, but she didn't pull away. It was just dinner, she told herself. What harm could come from one meal? Mason sat in his study later that night, a glass of expensive scotch untouched before him. What was he doing? The plan had been simple: make Grace fall for him, win the bet, move on. But somewhere along the way, things had gotten complicated. He enjoyed her company, genuinely enjoyed it. Their conversations challenged him. Her perspective on life, despite having so little, humbled him. And when she smiled, when she smiled, something inside him shifted. This morning, he'd surprised himself by making arrangements to purchase her father's old farm. It wasn't part of the bet. It wasn't even a strategic move to win her heart. He simply wanted to see her happy. His phone buzzed with a text from Victor. Monthly meeting tomorrow, progress report on the bet required. Mason grimaced. The bet. Right. That's what this was supposed to be about. But as he prepared for bed, Mason couldn't stop thinking about the way Grace's eyes had lit up when she talked about her father's farm, or how her hand had felt in his, warm, strong, and somehow right. For the first time in his life, Mason Rhodes, the man who always got what he wanted, wasn't sure what he wanted anymore, and that terrified him. Sunday arrived, bringing with it both anticipation and anxiety for Grace. She'd spent far too long choosing an outfit and doing her hair, effort she tried to justify as normal for any outing, not specifically because she was having lunch with Mason. They met at a small cafe in town, away from the curious eyes of other farm workers. Mason was already waiting when she arrived, standing to greet her with a warm smile that made her heart beat faster. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes appreciative as they took in her simple sundress and loose hair. "Thank you," Grace replied, suddenly shy. In the context of a date, because that's what this was, she'd finally admitted to herself, Mason seemed different, less the farm manager and more just a man, an attractive, attentive man who made her feel special. The meal was simple but delicious, and conversation flowed easily between them. Mason asked about her mother, showing genuine concern for Margaret's health. Grace found herself opening up about the struggles of the past few years, the mounting medical bills, the fear of losing their small rental home, the exhaustion of working multiple jobs to stay afloat. "You've carried so much," Mason said, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers. "Most people would have broken under that kind of pressure." Grace shrugged. "You do what you have to for the people you love." "Not everyone does," Mason countered. "Some people run from responsibility. You've embraced it at great personal cost." His understanding touched something deep inside Grace. Most men she'd known had been intimidated by her responsibilities or had expected her to choose between them. And her mother. Mason seemed to accept, even admire, her devotion to family. After lunch, neither wanted the day to end. They took a walk through the town's small park, talking about everything and nothing. When Mason's hand found hers again, Grace didn't hesitate to lace her fingers through his. "I've never met anyone like you," Mason said as they sat on a bench, watching ducks paddle across a small pond. "I find that hard to believe," Grace said with a small laugh. "You must know plenty of interesting people." "Wealthy people, successful people," Mason corrected. "Not necessarily good people." "And you think I'm good?" Grace asked, half teasing. Mason looked at her with complete seriousness. "I know you are. Better than I deserve." Before Grace could ask what he meant, Mason leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle, almost hesitant, as if he were asking permission. Grace found herself responding, her free hand moving to rest against his chest, feeling his heart race beneath her palm. When they parted, Mason's eyes searched hers. "I'm sorry if that was too forward." "It wasn't," Grace assured him, her voice barely above a whisper. Something was happening between them, something neither had expected but both could feel. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, reminding Grace she needed to return home, Mason made her promise to have dinner with him the following weekend. A real dinner date, he specified. "I want to take you somewhere special." Grace agreed, though. A small voice in the back of her mind warned her that she was setting herself up for heartbreak. Men like Mason didn't end up with women like her. But for once, she decided to silence that voice and allow herself to hope. As she drove home, Grace couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in years, she wasn't just existing. She was living, feeling, hoping. Little did she know that Mason was driving home with similar thoughts, his heart at war with his mind. The bet that had brought them together now threatened to tear them apart, because for the first time in his life, Mason Rhodes was falling in love, and he had no idea what to do about it. The summer months passed in a golden haze for Grace and Mason. Their Sunday lunch had turned into regular dates, dinners at charming, restaurants in neighboring towns, picnics on the property, and quiet evenings on Mason's porch watching the sunset. To Grace, it felt like a dream. Mason was attentive, kind, and genuinely interested in her life. He'd met her mother several times, bringing flowers and sitting patiently with Margaret as she showed him old family photos and told stories of Grace's childhood. Margaret had taken to him immediately, her motherly instincts telling her that, despite their different backgrounds, Mason was a good man. What Grace didn't know was the internal battle Mason fought daily. Each moment he spent with her deepened his feelings, but also sharpened his guilt. The bet loomed over him like a dark cloud, poisoning what had become the most real relationship of his life. On a warm August evening, Mason sat with his so-called friends on the back terrace of Richard's sprawling estate. The monthly gathering had become torture for Mason, a reminder of his deception. "So," Blake said, swirling his brandy, "it's been what, 3 months since our little wager began? How's our farmer's daughter doing?" Mason's jaw tightened. "Her name is Grace." "Ooh, defensive," Victor laughed. "Don't tell me you're actually falling for this girl." "She's not what I expected," Mason admitted cautiously. Richard leaned forward. "Meaning, what exactly? Is she falling for you or not?" Mason thought about Grace's smile when she saw him, the way she'd begun to trust him with her hopes and fears, the softness in her eyes when they kissed. "I believe she has feelings for me," he said, carefully. "But does she love you?" Blake pressed. That was the bet. Make her fall in love, then reveal it was all for money. The thought of hurting Grace that way made Mason physically ill. "These things take time. Or maybe you're stalling," Victor suggested. "The great Mason Rhodes finally met his match?" "Hardly," Mason scoffed, his pride flaring despite his conflicted heart. "I could ask her to marry me tomorrow and she'd say, yes." As soon as the words left his mouth, Mason regretted them. The three men exchanged glances, a predatory gleam in their eyes. "Well then," Richard said, "why don't you? The terms of the bet were marriage, after all." "It's too soon," Mason protested. "Sounds like an excuse to me," Blake said. "I think our friend here is afraid he'll lose." Mason knew he was being manipulated, but couldn't stop himself from taking the bait. "I'll propose when the time is right." "How about this?" Victor suggested. "Propose by the end of the month. If she says yes, we'll consider that proof she loves you, and you'll be halfway to winning. After the wedding, you reveal the truth, and if she leaves you, we pay up." Mason's stomach churned at the thought. "And if she doesn't leave?" "Then you've found yourself a gold digger after all," Richard laughed. "Either way, we need to move this bet along. It's getting boring." Boring. That's all this was to them. Entertainment at the expense of a good woman's heart. Mason felt a surge of revulsion, not just for his friends, but for himself. How had he ever agreed to this? "Fine," he said tightly. "End of the month." The men clinked glasses, sealing the modified terms. Mason barely tasted his drink, his mind racing with what he'd just committed to do. 2 days later, Grace stood in her mother's hospital room, her heart pounding with fear. Margaret had collapsed that morning, her breathing labored and her pulse weak. The doctor's words echoed in Grace's mind. "Her heart is failing faster than we expected. She needs a specialized procedure, but it's expensive and not fully covered by insurance. $30,000, the figure seemed impossible. We can look into hospital payment plans." the doctor had suggested gently, seeing Grace's distress. And there are some charitable foundations. I'll figure it out, Grace had interrupted. Just tell me when she needs the procedure. As soon as possible, had been the answer. Ideally within the next few weeks. Now, watching her mother sleep, thin and pale against the hospital sheets, Grace felt the weight of responsibility crushing her. Even with her increased wages from the organic program, there was no way she could come up with that kind of money quickly. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Mason stood there, concern etched on his handsome face. I came as soon as I got your message, he said, crossing to embrace her. Grace melted into his arms, allowing herself a moment of weakness. The doctor says she needs a procedure, an expensive one. Mason held her tighter. Whatever you need, Grace, I'm here. I don't know what to do, she confessed. The costs, it's impossible. Mason pulled back enough to look into her eyes. Nothing is impossible. We'll figure this out together, I promise. The conviction in his voice gave Grace hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Together? Yes, Mason said firmly. You're not alone in this, Grace. Not anymore. Something in his tone made Grace look at him more closely. Mason? I can't expect you to help with this. We've only been dating a few months. But I care about you, he said, the simple words carrying weight. Both of you. Grace's heart swelled with emotion. She'd grown to care deeply for Mason over the summer, but had been careful not to put a name to those feelings. Now seeing his genuine concern for her mother, his willingness to stand by her in crisis, she could no longer deny the truth. She was falling in love with him. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Let me take you home, Mason suggested gently. You need rest. We can talk more tomorrow about options for your mother. Grace nodded, too emotionally exhausted to argue. As they left the hospital, Mason's hand found hers, strong and reassuring. Neither noticed the sleek black SUV parked across the street or the three men watching them with calculating eyes. The next morning, Grace woke to someone knocking on her front door. She'd spent most of the night researching medical loans and charity programs, finally falling into a restless sleep just before dawn. Bleary-eyed, she opened the door to find Mason standing there, looking suspiciously cheerful given the circumstances. "What are you doing here so early?" she asked, self-consciously smoothing her rumpled t-shirt. "I have news," he said. "May I come in?" Grace stepped aside, watching curiously as Mason entered her small living room. He seemed almost nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I made some calls last night," he began. "About your mother's procedure." Grace felt a flicker of hope. "Did you find a charity program that could help?" "Better," Mason said. "I found a doctor who specializes in cases like your mother's. He's agreed to do the procedure at a significant discount, and I've arranged for the remaining costs to be covered." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "That's not possible. We're talking about thousands of dollars." "It's taken care of," Mason insisted. "How? Why would a doctor offer such a discount to someone he doesn't even know?" Mason hesitated, and Grace saw something like guilt flash across his face. "I have connections." A suspicion that had been forming in Grace's mind suddenly crystallized. "Who are you, really?" she asked quietly. "No farm manager has the kind of connections that can arrange specialized medical care overnight." Mason's shoulders sagged. "I haven't been entirely honest with you, Grace." "Clearly," she said, crossing her arms. "Tell me the truth, now." He took a deep breath. "I'm not just a manager. I own the Rhodes farm, all of it. I'm Mason Rhodes." Grace felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. "The owner? You've been pretending to be a manager all this time." "Why?" Mason ran a hand through his hair, his expression pained. "It's complicated, but I need you to believe that my feelings for you are real. I care about you, Grace. I want to help your mother." Grace's mind raced, trying to make sense of this revelation. The mysterious paid medical bill, the excellent job opportunity, Mason's obvious wealth despite his supposed position, it all suddenly made sense. "So all this time you've been what? Slumming it with the help? Was this some kind of game to you?" The hurt in her voice was unmistakable. No, God, no, Grace. Mason stepped toward her, but she backed away. It started as something else, but it changed. I changed. Meeting you changed everything. Started as what? She demanded. Mason looked miserable. I can't tell you that, not yet, but I swear I never meant to hurt you. But you lied to me. Every day, every moment we spent together. It was all based on a lie. Not all of it, Mason insisted. My feelings for you are real, Grace. More real than anything I've ever felt. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, trying to process this betrayal. The man she'd been falling for didn't really exist, yet the pain in Mason's eyes seemed genuine, confusing her further. I don't know what to believe anymore, she whispered. Believe this, Mason said, dropping to one knee in a move that left Grace speechless. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. I love you, Grace Mitchell. I've never said those words to anyone before, but I'm saying them to you now because they're true. Will you marry me? Grace stared at the stunning diamond ring in shock. This couldn't be happening, not now, not like this. Mason, you can't be serious. You just admitted to lying about who you are and now you want me to marry you? I know the timing is terrible, he acknowledged, but my feelings are real. I love you and I want to spend my life with you. I want to take care of you and your mother. I want to give you back your father's farm. Grace's head snapped up. What did you say? Your father's farm, Mason repeated softly. I bought it. For you. The current owners were planning to sell anyway. It needs work to be farmable again, but it's yours if you want it. Tears filled Grace's eyes. You bought my family's farm. How did you even know which one it was? You described it perfectly. 40 acres, a spring-fed pond, old-growth trees along the back property line. I had my lawyer find it based on your family name and the description. The gesture was both incredible and overwhelming. No one had ever done anything remotely like this for her before. I don't understand you, Mason Rhodes, Grace said, wiping away a tear. Why would you do all this? Buy the farm, pay for my mother's procedure, propose marriage. We've only known each other a few months. Because I love you, he said simply. I didn't expect to. I didn't want to. But I do with all my heart. Grace could see the sincerity in his eyes, feel it in the tremor of his hand as he held the ring box. Despite his deception about his identity, everything else about their relationship had felt real. The way he listened to her, respected her, cared for her mother, those things couldn't be faked. I need time, she said finally. This is all too much to process at once. Mason nodded, closing the ring box but pressing it into her hand. Take all the time you need. The ring and my heart are yours whenever you're ready. After he left, Grace sat holding the small velvet box, her thoughts in turmoil. Mason had lied about who he was, but everything else, his kindness, his respect, his attention, had seemed genuine. And now he wanted to marry her, had bought her family's farm, and was arranging her mother's life-saving procedure. It was like something from a fairy tale. Too good to be true, and in Grace's experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. That evening, Mason sat in his study, staring at his phone. Grace hadn't called or texted since his proposal that morning. He hadn't. They expected an immediate yes, but her silence was excruciating. The door to his study burst open without a knock, and Richard strode in, followed by Blake and Victor. We saw you at the hospital last night, Richard said without preamble. Getting cozy with the farmhand and her dying mother. Mason stood up, anger flaring. Her mother isn't dying, and don't let yourselves into my house again. Touchy, Blake commented, helping himself to Mason's scotch. We also heard about your little proposal this morning. Moving faster than expected, aren't you? Mason froze. How do you know about that? We have eyes everywhere, Victor smirked. Did she say yes? She's thinking about it, Mason said tightly. And the bet is off. I'm done with this nonsense. The three men exchanged glances. Then Richard laughed. That's not how bets work, Mason. You can't just back out because you developed a conscience. Or is it because you actually fell for her? Blake asked, studying Mason's face. Oh my God. You did. The great Mason Rhodes brought low by a simple farm girl. There's nothing simple about Grace, Mason snapped. She's worth 10 of any of you. So defensive, Victor mocked. And to think soon you'll have to tell her that your entire relationship was based on a bet, that you only pursued her to prove you could make a poor woman fall in love with you without Using your money. Mason's blood ran cold. I won't tell her that because it's not true anymore. But it was true when you started, Richard pointed out. When you sought her out, when you created that fake job for her, when you first asked her out, it was all for the bet. The truth of it hit Mason like a physical blow. No matter how genuine his feelings were now, he couldn't change how things had begun. Maybe we should tell her, Blake suggested casually. Save her from marrying a man who targeted her as part of a cruel wager. If you go anywhere near her, Mason growled, I'll destroy you, financially, socially, completely. Richard raised an eyebrow. Big threats from someone in your position. The bet stands, Mason. Either you tell her the truth after the wedding and see if she stays, or we tell her now. Your choice. After they left, Mason poured himself a large drink, his hand shaking. He'd made a terrible mistake getting involved with these men, letting their toxic influence push him into the despicable bet. But he'd made an even worse mistake falling in love with Grace while keeping the truth from her. If he told her now, he'd lose her. If he waited until after they were married, the betrayal would be even greater. And if his so-called friends told her, Mason's phone chimed with a text message. It was from Grace. Yes, one simple word that should have been the happiest moment of his life. Instead, it filled him with equal parts joy and dread. She'd said yes, but her love was built on a foundation of lies. Sooner or later, those lies would come to light, and when they did, Mason knew he might lose the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him. Grace's mother was admitted for her procedure the following week. Mason handled all the arrangements, securing the best doctors and a private room. He visited daily, bringing flowers and sitting with Grace during the long hours of waiting. You don't have to stay, Grace told him on the second day, touched by his unwavering support. I know you have work to do. Mason took her hand. Nothing is more important than being here with you. When the doctors finally announced the procedure had been successful, Grace broke down in tears of relief. Mason held her, his strong arms a sanctuary from the fear and stress of the past weeks. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered against his chest. You don't have to thank me, he replied, kissing the top of her head. Just marry me. Grace smiled up at him through her tears. I already said yes. They agreed on a small ceremony in October, when the trees would be ablaze with fall colors and Margaret would be recovered enough to attend. Mason offered to plan a lavish wedding at the main house, but Grace preferred simplicity. Just us, my mother, and a few close friends, she insisted. I don't need anything fancy. Mason agreed readily, his relief obvious. Grace assumed he was happy she wasn't interested in a show of wealth. The truth was more complicated. Mason dreaded the thought of inviting his so-called friends to witness what should be the happiest day of his life, knowing they saw it only as the culmination of a cruel bet. News of their engagement spread quickly through the farm. Most workers were surprised. Relationships between management and field workers were rare enough, but for the owner himself to marry a farmhand was unprecedented. Some were genuinely happy for them. Others whispered that Grace was a gold digger who'd hit the jackpot. Grace heard the whispers but held her head high. She knew the truth of her feelings for Mason. She hadn't fallen in love with his money or his status. She'd fallen for the man who listened to her dreams, who respected her work ethic, who sat patiently with her ailing mother and never made Grace feel like a burden. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations. Mason surprised Grace by having her family's farmhouse renovated, preserving its original character, while updating the systems and adding modern conveniences. We can live here after the wedding, he suggested, as he gave her a tour of the completed workhouse. If you want, or we can stay at the main house, whatever makes you happy. Grace walked through the rooms of her childhood home, overwhelmed by emotion. You kept the original hardwood floors and the fireplace mantel your grandfather carved, Mason added. The contractor wanted to replace it, but I insisted it stay. It's perfect, Grace whispered, turning to embrace him. How did you know exactly what I'd want? Because I know you, Mason said, his voice thick with emotion, and I love you. In that moment, standing in the home of her childhood that Mason had lovingly restored, Grace felt completely, perfectly happy. All her doubts about his initial deception faded in the face of such tangible proof of his love. But as their wedding day approached, Mason grew increasingly tense. Grace attributed it to normal pre-wedding jitters, but the truth was far darker. The closer they came to marriage, the more terrified Mason became of losing her when the truth inevitably came out. Several times, he came close to confessing everything, the bet, the original deception, how his friends still expected him to reveal the truth after the wedding. But each time, the fear of seeing love turn to hatred in Grace's eyes stopped him. Instead, he channeled his guilt into making her happy, finalizing arrangements for her mother to receive ongoing care, legally transferring the deed to her family's farm into her name, making sure every detail of their small wedding was perfect. The night before the ceremony, Mason sat alone on the porch of Grace's family farmhouse, now fully restored and ready for them to begin their life together. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and promise. Tomorrow he would marry the woman he loved, and soon after, he would likely lose her forever. Unless he found the courage to tell her the truth himself and beg for a forgiveness he didn't deserve. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Mason made his decision. After the wedding, before his so-called friends could interfere, he would tell Grace everything. He would lay his heart bare and accept whatever judgment she passed, because a love built on lies wasn't love at all, and Grace deserved nothing less than the full, unvarnished truth, even if it cost him everything. The October day dawned clear and crisp, with a sky so perfectly blue it seemed painted for the occasion. In the bedroom of her childhood home, Grace stood before a full-length mirror, hardly recognizing herself in the simple but elegant wedding dress Mason had insisted on buying her. "You look just like an angel," Margaret said from her seat by the window, her eyes shining with tears of joy. Though still recovering from her procedure, she had insisted on helping Grace prepare for her wedding day. "Do you think he'll like it?" Grace asked, smoothing the ivory satin nervously. Margaret smiled. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars, sweetheart. He'd think you were beautiful in a potato sack." Grace laughed, but her mother's words warmed her heart. It was true. Mason looked at her with a love so profound it sometimes took her breath away. Whatever doubts she'd harbored about his initial deception regarding his identity had faded in the face of his unwavering devotion. "I never thought I'd have this," Grace admitted softly. "A man who loves me for me. The farm back in our family. You healthy again, it feels like a dream." "Not a dream," Margaret said firmly, "just the life you've always deserved." A knock at the door announced the arrival of Sarah, Grace's childhood friend, who would be her only bridesmaid. "It's time," Sarah said, peeking in. Her eyes widened at the sight of Grace. "Oh my goodness, you're stunning!" With butterflies dancing in her stomach, Grace allowed Sarah to help with the final touches, a simple veil, her grandmother's pearl, earrings and a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the meadow behind the farmhouse. Outside, a small gathering of guests waited in the garden that Mason had restored to its former glory. An arbor of climbing roses marked the spot where they would exchange their vows, with chairs arranged in a semicircle for their guests, just a few close friends and trusted farm employees. Mason stood beneath the arbor, looking more nervous than Grace had ever seen him. Dressed in a simple dark suit, he shifted his weight from foot to foot, repeatedly checking his pocket for the rings. Jim, the foreman who had first pointed Grace out to Mason, stood beside him as best man, offering quiet reassurance. Neither man noticed the sleek black SUV that pulled up at the edge of the property, or the three well-dressed men who emerged from it. As the small string quartet began to play, Mason looked up to see Grace walking toward him on her mother's arm. The sight of her, radiant in her simple gown, her face glowing with happiness, nearly brought him to his knees. How had he gotten so lucky? And how could he have risked this precious gift on something as trivial as a bet? Grace reached the arbor, and Margaret placed her daughter's hand in Mason's with a whispered, "Take care of my girl." "With my life," Mason promised, his voice thick with emotion. The pastor began the ceremony, but Mason barely heard the words. All he could focus on was Grace's hand in his, the trust in her eyes, and the crushing weight of the secret he still carried. When the time came to exchange vows, Mason's hands trembled as he placed the ring on Grace's finger. I, Mason Rhodes, take you, Grace Mitchell, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward. I promise to love you without reservation, to honor and respect you, to protect and cherish you all the days of my life. The words, though traditional, carried the weight of a deeper promise, one he intended to keep regardless of what happened when the truth came out. Grace's voice was clear and steady as she recited her own vows, her eyes never leaving his. I, Grace Mitchell, take you, Mason Rhodes, to be my husband. I promise to stand by your side in good times and bad, to believe in you when no one else will, to build a life of love and honesty with you, for as long as we both shall live. Honesty. The word pierced Mason's heart like an arrow. He hadn't given her honesty from the beginning, and now it might cost him everything. By the power vested in me, the pastor announced, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Mason drew Grace into his arms, pouring all his love and regret into their first kiss as a married couple. The small gathering of guests applauded, none louder than Margaret, who wiped away tears of joy. As they turned to face their friends, Mason spotted them, Richard, Blake, and Victor, standing at the back of the garden with smug expressions. His blood ran cold. They shouldn't be here. He hadn't invited them. Their presence could only mean trouble. Mason, what's wrong? Grace asked, feeling his body tense beside her. He forced a smile. Nothing. Everything's perfect. The reception was a simple affair held in the farmhouse's newly renovated barn. Twinkling lights hung from the rafters, tables adorned with wildflowers lined the edges, and the center had been cleared for dancing. Mason kept Grace close, guiding her through the customary first dance, the cake cutting, the toasts. All the while he watched his unwelcome guests from the corner of his eye, dreading their purpose for attending. His opportunity to speak with them came when Grace went to check on her mother, who had begun to tire from the day's excitement. You weren't invited, Mason said coldly, approaching the three men who stood by the bar. We wouldn't miss this for the world, Richard replied with a cruel smile. The culmination of our little wager. Mason's jaw clenched. The bet is off. I told you that. That's not how it works, Blake reminded him. The terms were clear. Marry her, tell her the truth, and see if she stays. If she leaves, we pay up. And if she doesn't tell her immediately, we will, Victor added. We're getting bored waiting. Mason felt a surge of panic. This is my wedding day. Don't do this. Then do it yourself, Richard challenged. Tonight, or we'll do it for you tomorrow. Before Mason could respond, Grace appeared at his side, slipping her arm through his. There you are, husband, she smiled at the three men. I don't believe we've been introduced. Mason's throat went dry. Grace, these are business associates, Richard Coleman, Blake Thompson, and Victor Davis. How nice of you to come, Grace said politely, though Mason could sense her confusion. He hadn't mentioned inviting any business associates. We wouldn't miss it, Richard said smoothly. Mason and I go way back. In fact, we made a very special bet that led to this happy day. Mason's heart stopped. Richard, a bet? Grace asked, her smile faltering. What kind of bet? Victor grinned maliciously. Should we tell her, Mason, or will you? Mason felt as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff with no choice but to jump. Grace, can we talk privately? Please. The concern in her eyes nearly broke him. Of course. Mason led her outside, away from the lights and music and prying eyes. The autumn night was cool, a crescent moon hanging in the sky above them. What's going on? Grace asked. Who are those men, really? And what bet were they talking about? Mason took a deep breath. This was it, the moment that could destroy everything. But he couldn't let those vultures be the ones to tell her. They're not just business associates, he began. They're people I used to consider friends. Wealthy, entitled men who think money is the only thing that matters in life. Grace frowned. What does that have to do with us? With today? Mason reached for her hands, holding them tightly, as if she might slip away at any moment. Grace, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you months ago. The fear in his voice must have alarmed her because she squeezed his hands encouragingly. Whatever it is, we can face it together. I hope you still feel that way after you hear this, Mason said, his voice breaking slightly. "The day I approached you in the fields, when I offered you the position on the organic team, it wasn't by chance." "What do you mean?" I sought. "You out specifically. Not because of your work ethic or skills, though both are exceptional. I sought you out because of a bet." Grace's hands stiffened in his. "A bet," she repeated, her voice hollow. "Those men, Richard, Blake, and Victor, they challenged me to prove that I could make a woman fall in love with me without using my wealth or status. They bet $100,000 that I couldn't do it." The color drained from Grace's face. As understanding dawned, "And I was your target." "Yes," Mason admitted, the word like ash in his mouth. "I agreed to their cruel, stupid bet. I pretended to be just a manager. I created the organic program as an excuse to get closer to you. I pursued you with the intention of making you fall in love with me, all to win a bet." Grace pulled her hands from his, taking a step back. "So everything, all of it, was a lie?" "Not everything," Mason insisted desperately. "Yes, it started as a game, a challenge to my ego. But Grace, somewhere along the way, something changed. I changed. I fell in love with you, truly, deeply in love. The bet became meaningless. All that mattered was you." Grace wrapped her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. "Do you have any idea how this makes me feel? Like a fool, a project, an experiment in your little rich boy game." "You were never that to me," Mason pleaded. "Not after I got to know you. Everything I've done since then, buying your father's farm, helping with your mother's medical care, it wasn't to win the bet. It was because I love you." "How can I believe that?" Grace demanded, tears welling in her eyes. "How can I believe anything you say? Our entire relationship was founded on a lie." "Not our love," Mason insisted. "That's real. It's the most real thing I've ever felt." Grace shook her head, backing away further. "I trusted you, I married you, and all this time I was just a pawn in some twisted game." "The game stopped mattering to me months ago," Mason said. "I've been trying to find the courage to tell you, to face losing you rather than keeping this secret. Yet you waited until after I said I do," Grace pointed out bitterly. "Were you hoping I'd be less likely to leave once we were married?" The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth to it. "I was a coward," Mason admitted. "I was terrified of losing you, but I couldn't let those men be the ones to tell you. I had to be the one, even if it meant destroying everything." Grace wiped away a tear. "Did you win? That's what this was all about, right? Did you win your bet?" Mason's face crumpled. "Grace, please." "Did you win?" she insisted. "According to their terms, yes," he answered quietly. "You fell in love with me. You married me. I completed the challenge." "Congratulations," Grace said, her voice cold. $100,000 richer, and all it cost you was my heart." With that, she turned and walked away, heading not toward the barn where their guests celebrated, but toward the old pickup truck she'd driven to work on her first day at the Rhodes farm. "Grace, wait," Mason called, running after her. "Where are you going?" She paused, her hand on the truck door. "Anywhere but here. I need time to think, to figure out if anything between us was real." "All of it was real," Mason insisted. "My love for you is real." Grace looked at him, her eyes filled with pain and betrayal. "Maybe. But right now I can't separate the truth from the lies. I need space, Mason." "It's our wedding night," he said weakly. "Yes," she agreed, her voice breaking. "It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life." Without another word, she climbed into the truck and drove away, leaving Mason standing alone in the moonlight, the sound of celebration continuing obliviously in the barn behind him. 3 days passed without word from Grace. Mason learned from Margaret that she was staying with her friend Sarah, refusing all contact with him. He sent flowers, letters, even her favorite pastries from the bakery in town, all returned unopened. His so-called friends had the audacity to leave him a check for $100,000 with a congratulatory note. A bet well won. Worth every penny for the entertainment. Mason tore the check to pieces and sent the fragments back with a note of his own. "Our friendship is over. Stay away from me and my wife." On the 4th day, Mason couldn't stand the separation any longer. He drove to Sarah's small house on the edge of town, determined to speak with Grace, to beg for another chance if necessary. Sarah answered the door, her expression cool. "She doesn't want to see you." "Please," Mason said, his desperation evident. "I just need 5 minutes." "You've hurt her terribly," Sarah informed him. "Do you have any idea what it's like for her? To learn that your entire relationship was based on a bet? That the man she loves targeted her specifically because she was poor and vulnerable?" Mason winced at the harsh but accurate assessment. "I know I don't deserve her forgiveness, but I love her, Sarah, more than I've ever loved anyone or anything. Please, just tell her I'm here." Something in his brokenness must have convinced Sarah, because after a long moment she sighed and stepped back. "Wait here." Minutes later, Grace appeared, looking tired and pale. Mason's heart ached at the sight of her, still so beautiful, but wounded in a way he might never be able to heal. "5 minutes," she said, stepping onto the porch and closing the door behind her. "How are you?" Mason asked, then immediately regretted the inane question. "I'm sorry, that's not what I came to say." "What did you come to say?" Grace asked quietly. Mason took a deep breath. "I came to tell you that I understand if you can never forgive me. What I did, agreeing to that bet, targeting you, lying about who I was, it was unforgivable. But I need you to know that my love for you is real. It's the most real thing in my life." "How can I believe that?" Grace asked. "How can I trust anything when it all started with a lie?" "Judge me by my actions since I fell in love with you," Mason suggested, "not by how things began, but by what they became." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Did you really buy back my father's farm just to win a bet?" "No," Mason said firmly. "I bought it because I saw how much it meant to you, because I wanted to give you back something precious that had been taken from you, because I love you." "And my mother's procedure?" "I would have moved heaven and earth to save her," Mason said. "Not for a bet. For you, because I couldn't bear to see you in pain." Grace looked away, tears filling her eyes. "I want to believe you." "Then give me a chance to prove it," Mason pleaded. "I've terminated my friendships with those 3 men. I've donated $100,000, the amount of the bet, to a foundation that helps small family farms stay afloat during hard times. I've put your family's farm in your name only, so you'll always have it regardless of what happens between us." These actions seemed to surprise Grace. "You've been busy." "I've been trying to right my wrongs," Mason explained. "I know it's not enough, it might never be enough, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you if you'll let me." Grace studied him, searching for something in his eyes. "I need more time, Mason. This isn't something I can just get over in a few days." "I understand," he said, though the thought of continued separation was agonizing. "Take all the time you need. I'll be waiting, however long it takes." As he turned to leave, Grace called after him. "Mason?" He looked back, hope flickering in his chest. "I do love you," she said softly. That part wasn't a lie, but love isn't always enough. Trust has to be there too. "I'll earn back your trust," he promised. "Somehow, someday I will." It seemed 2 weeks passed, agonizingly slow for Mason. He threw himself into work, overseeing the harvest and preparing the farm for winter. Every day he visited Margaret, making sure she had everything she needed during her recovery, and subtly gathering news about Grace. "She's hurting," Margaret told him honestly, "but she's also confused. The man she fell in love with, the one who sits here with me, who cares about her dreams, who looks at her like she hung the moon, that man doesn't seem like someone who would do something so cruel." "I'm not that man anymore," Mason admitted. "Meeting Grace changed me. Loving her changed me." Margaret patted his hand sympathetically. "Give her time. My daughter doesn't give her heart easily, but when she does, it's forever." On a cold November day, Mason was walking the eastern boundary of the property when he spotted a familiar figure by the old oak tree, where he and Grace had shared their first kiss. His heart raced as he approached cautiously, afraid she might disappear like a mirage. "Grace?" She turned, bundled in a warm coat against the autumn chill. "I thought I might find you out here." "I walk this path every day," Mason explained. "It reminds me of you," Grace nodded, looking out over the land they both loved. "I've been thinking a lot." Mason waited, hardly daring to breathe. "What you did was wrong," she said finally. "Making that bet, targeting me. It was cruel and manipulative. I know, Mason acknowledged, his head bowed in shame. But, Grace continued, I've also been thinking about who you became during our time together. The man who sat with my mother for hours, listening to her stories. The man who remembered my father's farm from one conversation and bought it back for me. The man who looks at me like I'm the most precious thing in his world. Mason looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. That's who I really am. Who you helped me become. I believe you, Grace said quietly. It's taken me weeks of soul-searching, but I believe that your love is real. That somewhere along the way the bet stopped mattering and your heart took over. It did, Mason confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Grace, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. These weeks without you have been the darkest of my life. Grace stepped closer to him. I can't promise it will be easy. Rebuilding trust takes time. There might be days when I remember how things started and feel that hurt all over again. I'll be there, Mason promised. Every day, proving my love, earning your trust back minute by minute, hour by hour. That's all I ask, Grace said. That and complete honesty from this moment forward. No more secrets, no more lies. None, Mason agreed fervently. My heart is an open book to you. Grace reached for his hand, her touch sending warmth through his entire body. Then I'm willing to try again, to build something real from the ashes of how we began. Mason pulled her gently into his arms, hardly believing this second chance he didn't deserve, but would spend his life honoring. I will never let you regret this decision, Grace, I swear it. As they walked hand in hand back toward the farmhouse, their home, Mason reflected on the twisted path that had brought them here. A cruel bet made in arrogance had led him to the woman who taught him what really mattered in life. He had nearly lost her because of his deception, but somehow, miraculously, she had found room in her heart to forgive him. Some might call it luck. Mason knew better. It was Grace, both the woman he loved and the second chance he'd been given. 1 year later, the December snow fell softly outside the windows of the farmhouse, casting a peaceful hush over the land. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of pine from the Christmas tree mingled with the aroma of apple cider warming on the stove. Grace stood by the window, watching the snow transform their world into a winter wonderland. Mason came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Grace smiled, leaning back against his solid chest. "I was just thinking about how much can change in a year." Indeed, the past 12 months had been a journey of healing and growth. There had been difficult moments, times when the memory of the bet had resurfaced, bringing with it fresh pain. But Mason had kept his promise, proving his love daily through actions both big and small. They had recommitted to each other in a private ceremony on the first anniversary of their original wedding day, exchanging vows that were all the more meaningful for the trials they had overcome. Margaret, now fully recovered, had moved into the renovated guest cottage on the property, close enough for daily visits, but allowing the newlyweds their privacy. Under Grace's guidance, her father's 40 acres had come alive again, producing organic crops that commanded premium prices at farmers' markets throughout the region. And Mason had changed too. The cold, calculating businessman who cared only for profit had been replaced by a man who understood the true value of connection, to the land, to community, and most importantly, to the woman who had transformed his heart. "Any regrets?" Mason asked softly, a question he still posed occasionally, needing the reassurance. Grace turned in his arms to face him. "Not one," she said honestly. "Everything that happened, even the painful parts, led us here. And here is exactly where I want to be." Mason bent to kiss her, his lips gentle against hers. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace Rhodes, more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, her heart full. "Not for your money, not for what you can give me, but for who you are." As they stood together in the warm glow of the firelight, wrapped in each other's arms, the bitter bet that had brought them together seemed like a distant memory. What remained was love, real, tested, and stronger for having survived the storm. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the land in a pristine blanket of white. Within the farmhouse, a wealthy man who had once had everything but a heart held the woman who had given him one, grateful beyond words for the wager he had nearly lost but ultimately won, not because of money or manipulation, but because of love, true love, the kind that forgives, that redeems, that transforms, the kind that once found is worth fighting for with everything you have, the kind of love that, against all odds, Mason and Grace had found in each other. The end.